This is Ken Pyle with Woidke TV. We're at Parks Associates Connections Conference at the CTIA, and we're with Paul Woidke of NAGRA Open TV. And you just pointed out that that's an important segue into our conversation about advanced advertising.
The Open TV component of NAGRA is really focused on advanced advertising and where advertising fits into the into this emerging multi-platform world.
And you were on a panel talking about multi-platform and multi-platform advertising, and we spoke about it last year. Well, where are we in 2013 relative to maybe where we were a year ago?
So the panel, I was on one and sat through another, one on connected TVs, one on second screen. There's a lot of inertia behind what's going to happen on these new platforms, especially being driven by the MVPDs themselves. I think when you and I talked last, we had a whole lot of hypotheses about what the over-the-top competitors were going to do. But we're having lots of questions and ideas and product development being driven by the MVPDs.
I suppose the whole idea of the cable card and the idea of the portability has kind of gone away. Now people, the MVPDs, the cable operators and telcos and so forth, are looking at kind of these connected devices as the way to get to the consumer, it sounds like.
We certainly see the cable operators, the satellite operators, the telco operators sort of creating their own over-the-top environment, especially, as you just said, through the set-top box changes. A strong initiative to move into IP-delivered video. Now, IP-delivered video can be internet-type over-the-top, but it can also be through the managed network. But through the managed network, it's still IP, which means it keeps some of the inherent qualities of being addressable and of being interactive. And these are the things that are driving the interest from the big content providers.
Well, now it seems like there's always kind of this tension between the content provider who has the content and wants to sell to eyeballs, and then the MVPDs who have that distribution channel and they want to sell advertising to eyeballs. So where's that kind of playing out as you go to different screens? Who's getting the avails, if you will?
Well, so I think that all has to do with the business cases, but and we can come back to that. Okay. I think that the driving focus that we've seen, though, is what has moved us so strongly since we talked last into our next generation platform, our XG platform, where the cable operators now want to be able, on a single invoice to an agency, to include the linear, the on-demand, the broadband content from their web portals, the broadband video content. All of this is coming together onto a single invoice through a single buy, sell, and invoice process, because that's how the agencies are viewing this. They're less worried about the distinction between, well, was this in linear, was this in on-demand, and they more want to know, where did I get the impressions, where did I get the rating points?
Well, and that's a huge change, isn't it? I mean, because it probably has huge implications for workflow and having sets of tools that can operate across all these different screens, right? Oh,
that's probably the biggest part of it. We started at the back end with just the invoicing process, but you're exactly right. The workflow processes, of course, have been very complicated for VOD all along. That's one of the things that stood in the way, I think, of dynamic ad insertion, of DAI getting off and running as quickly as it should have. But operators are now compensating for that. They're moving forward, and what they've done in the DAI space is now starting to broaden out into what they'll do in the broadband space.
And I imagine even at the creative level too, right? You have a device that's this big and you have a device that's this big. How you present the advertising is a challenge, right?
Not only is it a challenge if you're watching, shall we say, the same piece of content, whether I'm watching something on the big screen in the living room or I'm watching it on my tablet at a later time, but also the fact, and this is one of the things that we just talked about in the panels today, is when you're watching something on the primary screen, what am I watching on that second screen? And it can be related to what's on the primary screen, but it's probably not the same thing. I'm watching a show on the primary screen, and on the second screen I'm trying to remember, where did I see that actor? What was the last show that he did? Where did that piece of music come from? It's another whole environmental layer that can be there and that can be monetized through its own advertising.
And are you seeing a lot of that then, that interaction and really kind of the metadata, if you will, the metadata as its own kind of content?
Well, the whole metadata drive, especially in this space, Cable Labs has been extraordinarily active in this space with strong support from operators like Comcast and Time Warner in terms of trying to say, okay, how are we going to use this metadata within our plant as we move across these platforms, especially as we're just at the tip of the iceberg for those IP set-top boxes now, but we see where Comcast, for example, has gone with the X1 box, now talking about 5 tuners on that box. Wow, how am I going to manage and keep track of all the content?
Well, and that's interesting because, at one level that's, kind of more processing in the home, but it seems like we also have other developments where the processing is in the cloud.
Oh, I think more and more of it will be in the cloud, and what we'll see in the homes is we'll see things like the traditional set-top box become the long-discussed gateway to the home, because it might still be a set-top box attached to the primary TV set, but it's going to have its own distribution connections to other TVs and Wi-Fi connections to those second and third screens in the home. So it really becomes the portal by which the content is monetized by the distributor. And that goes back to your comment and your question. That's where I think we start to see the synthesis of the content providers and the content distributors monetizing this by working together.
Well, and we're talking about within the home, but one of the things that to me, one of the fascinating developments is the whole Wi-Fi offload and that sort of thing by the operators. And I'm curious if you see that as part of a step in a process to perhaps even providing advertising that's geographic based that the operator's providing.
Oh, I certainly think that, of course, cable has always been a geographic-based advertising play in the old traditional QAM plant, simply because that was how it was distributed. But what you said really hits the nail on the head, because as they move into IP, the first thing you have to do is protect your #1 revenue stream. And that's linear television. And so even though it's now done in IP, which means it doesn't have that geographic basis, you still want the advertising to be tied to that. What we'll layer on top of it, and this is where the value add will come, is to be able within that geographic area to do demographically based targeting in the IP delivered environment, which has been so fundamentally difficult to do in the QAM environment. I mean, how many years have you and I talked about, is this the year of addressable advertising? Well, what really stood in the way was, how do you use QAM-based bandwidth in order to do that, especially in an HD environment? As we move into the IP space, and as we move into the multi-platform space, that becomes far more achievable.
It becomes, you can personalize it at some level.
A second screen device, it's very easy to know who's using that screen and who's signed into it. At the primary screen, the 55-inch screen, the living room screen, you might be doing your addressability based on the demographics of the household, because you don't know how many 3, 4, 5, 6 people are watching the TV. But demographic household addressability on that screen is perfectly fine. But then when you go to the smartphone or the tablet, now you're able to really take it down to say, who is the person in the household that I am reaching? And by the way, we see over and over again that consumers would rather see an ad that interests them than to see an ad that doesn't interest them anyhow.
Well, and where I was going with the Wi-Fi question too, and I think you kind of touched upon it, but the whole idea of, I'm near the pizza parlor, so instead of being at home when getting the pizza on demand ad for the video on demand, you're near the pizza parlor and it pops up on your smartphone, buy this pizza. Is that kind of where things are going, do you think?
Certainly location-based advertising is something that we're seeing experimented with in the space, and I think that people will continue to move in that space.
And so from, back to the business model perspective, I would imagine that broadcasters aren't going to want to give up some of these things, or the content providers. I mean, they'll want to get kind of their share of this advertising. Where is kind of that middle ground between them?
Oh, well, I think that there are still some interesting developments that we'll see play out in that area. Just last week in New York City, where I'm from, ABC Television, we're not talking about the ABC cable networks, ABC Television announced a live streaming app Now, on abc.com up until now, you could see yesterday's programs today because they were on a 24-hour delay, but this is a huge step. ABC television, New York first, New York and Philadelphia first, with other markets to follow, live streaming programming through abc.com. Here's something that's interesting, carrying different commercial content than on the broadcast station. Opening the doorway to the fact that when you're streaming in that space, you have exactly what you were asking about, the ability to do customizations that make sense to that portable, to that mobile device, to that app that's on the move.
Yeah, it's also an authenticated service too, right? You have to be authenticated through a MVPD.
You have to be authenticated for that, which also matches what Turner announced last week also, where Turner is now taking, I believe, TNT and TBS into the same space. So that I think that we're going to continue to see, and back to your earlier question, although there are frequently the rumbles between the content providers and the content distributors, so here you see ABC acknowledging their fellowship and their business partnership and creating an allegiance to the work that they do with satellite, cable, and telco operators by recognizing them as the authenticating service.
Yeah, no, that is very powerful, and especially on the broadcast side, the fact that it has very interesting implications long-term for must-carry and retransmission consent.
Certainly does, and a lot of this comes back to things that we discussed on panels today, where at the end of the day, we're really recognizing that if we don't generate the revenue to create great new programming, there won't be great new programming, and if there's not great new programming, what are people going to be watching on the new services anyhow? Yeah. So I think that we'll see those partnerships to help see that those programs are created.
Well, Paul, always great talking to you, and it sounds like we'll have a conversation next year.
We'll do that. We'll certainly do that, Ken. So much. Thank you.